Hello, Oboots from around the world, and welcome to our Oboot Zoom session where Anya, who is 14 years old and lives in India, will be interviewing our guest changemaker, Professor Shea Howell, who is from Detroit, USA. Shea Howell is a professor, writer, and community activist based in Detroit. She is a founding and board member of the Boggs Center, a space which helps to foster productive, sustainable, and ecologically conscious communities. She has a long and storied career at Oakland University as a professor of political communication. Professor Howell is also very engaged in politics in Detroit. Dr. Shea's work links to several sustainable development goals, especially to goal number 10, reduced inequality. Anya will ask questions to Dr. Shea about her background, her journey, her work, her skills, and her impact. Hope that you will enjoy this session. I will now start with our first question to our guest, and then leave the floor to my co-host, Anya. So, Dr. Shea, can you please tell us a little bit about you and what you do for work?
Well, as you said, I'm living in Detroit, where I have lived for now almost 50 years. And Detroit was one of the first cities in the world that was shaped by industrial production. And it was also one of the first cities abandoned by industrial capital. And so we have had to face the question of how do you create life in a city when the industrial society is gone. And that has been a tremendous gift. So much of my work is about reimagining, redeveloping, recreating life on principles that are past an industrial age and thinking about life that is sustainable, regenerative, supportive, and productive. So that's my work.
So, I wanted to ask, what does your job feel like? Is it difficult to be an activist?
Well, I think there is a difference between what is a job and what is work. And
yes.
There's a wonderful old song in the United States that says, my life is more than my job, more than my work, and my work is more than my job. And so part of what I'm from the generation of activists who saw political activity and social change as something we did as part of our whole life, not something that we did as a job. Although my job as a university professor is one which gave me enormous freedom in pushing, thinking, and critical ideas further into the future. And so I like to think that my work influenced how I did my job. And I think a lot of people in my generation, especially from the 1960s, see that distinction. Does that help you?
Yes, it does. So, did you face any challenges in your journey?
Oh, yes. Don't we all, right? I bet you've had some too already. Yes. Because, of course, yes. That's how we grow, isn't it? Life is a challenge every day. But I think, if I were going to think about the biggest challenge, it's how to keep thinking ahead and not getting caught in the past and past ideas. Even for somebody your age, you have a past already that is starting to shape how you are looking at the present. And for me, when I have so much past,
yes,
there are a lot of old ideas that can get in the way. That's why I was very excited to come to talk with you, because what you're thinking is very, very different about the world than what I'm thinking, because just of where you are in time. So I think the biggest challenge is how do we keep thinking new things, because we know the world is always changing and we need to be able to change with it.
Yes.
Excuse me. But the trick or the important thing is to not just change, but to change in ways that advance our humanity, that make us more open, more connected, more conscious, and more creative, and more caring, I think, too. Excuse me. It's pollen season here.
So, like, what inspired you to do this work? Like, be an activist, a writer?
Well, you know, I often say what inspired me to do this work was my first grade teacher. When I grew up in a little coal mining town in the Appalachian Mountains, and my grandfather did not have the use of his legs because he had been in a mining accident, and so couldn't move around much. But what he could do was sit in a wheelchair or in a big chair and have me as a small person sit on his lap. And he would read to me every morning from the local newspaper. And so I just naturally learned to read. And then because I could read, he taught me how to write. So by the time I went to first grade, I could read and write. And I could write cursive, not just print. So when the teachers handed out the pencils and asked us to write our names and were trying to help us, I just quickly wrote mine. And whap, this teacher hit my hand with a ruler. And she announced that we were not going to have any left-handed people in this classroom. And I'm like, what? I had never heard that there was anything wrong with being left-handed. And so this went on for about 3 days. And at the end of the third day, I said, I've had enough. I can already read and write. Clearly, these people can't teach me anything. I'm out of here. So every morning I'd take my lunch. I'd go out from our little apartment above a hardware store, and all the kids would go up the hill to school. And I went down the road to where what we called the hobos lived, which you would now think of as people without homes. And they taught me how to fish. They taught me how to make biscuits on a stick. They taught me how to drink and make coffee. And I quickly learned there was a difference between education and schooling. I had gotten education from my grandfather. Schooling wasn't worth much. And so of course, you know, ultimately the school got a hold of my parents. Ultimately, I had to go back. But I learned that there is much more to the world than what people in authority sometimes tell you. And that often people who are looked down upon by those in authority know a lot and can teach you a lot. So I like to think that from very early on, I understood that there are things about the world we have to question. And once you start questioning, it doesn't take long to become a radical.
Yes. Like, I also love to write. I just love writing.
Yes. Yeah. You know, it's funny. Aanya, if we had this conversation 10 years ago, maybe even 20, I wouldn't have thought of myself as a writer. I think of myself more as a storyteller or a speaker. But over the last decade or so, I think of myself much more as a writer now. And for me, the most interesting thing about writing is what I end up with on a page isn't actually where I started. I have learned that writing is a process of discovery and a process of inquiry. And it also requires a kind of honesty. Last night, I went to an event with a woman who's just written her autobiography that you might enjoy reading. She's a Japanese-American woman named Nobuko Miyamoto. She's 82. And she was saying that in writing her autobiography, she had to face some truths about herself that she had evaded her whole life. And I think that's a part of writing as well. You have to both look inward and outward at the same time. So now I think I love myself as a writer as well as a speaker.
Like, can you please share us the most tough thing you did in your journey?
Well, today, right before I got on the phone with you, I was watching the Moral March on Washington being led by Reverend Barber, a new poor people's campaign. And in 1968, I was part of the first poor people's campaign. And am very glad to see that happening here again in the United States, because we definitely need a progressive voice. So I would say for me, one of the most important things was sort of by accident inviting Martin Luther King Jr. to come speak at my college campus. And that was in 1967, just before he gave what is one of his most famous speeches and most important speeches, the speech against the war in Vietnam, against racism, and against militarism. He said, what we need is a radical revolution in values against racism, materialism, and militarism. And that call for a radical revolution in values from King has shaped my life. And so I think I'm very fortunate, I think, in my life to have had the experience of meeting Dr. King, but more importantly, of organizing for the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. And of course, when King was killed, that was an important lesson for me as well. But by that time, I was involved in civil rights activities and very, very much involved in supporting the activities of a group called the Black Panthers. And I was in Chicago at the time when a young man named Fred Hampton was killed by the FBI and the police. And the local newspapers and the police and everybody said, oh, this was a shootout, it was self-defense. But the Panthers organized a tour of Fred Hampton's house, and you could see it was not a shootout, it was an execution. And so I became part of a group that organized suburban people from my university to come and be part of this tour. It's unbelievable now that the police were so confident in what they said that it never occurred to them to cover up the actual crime scene. So I think that experience with the killing of Fred Hampton and seeing how, I guess the phrase in the movement is truth will out, that you can tell the truth and it can make a difference. And that certainly shaped me. And then as a woman, being aware of the women's movement and becoming part of, feminism and nonviolence. And through the women's movement, really learning that I'm a lesbian. So all of that happened as part of my journey in life.
What advice can you give to the youngsters who want to become an activist?
I guess the first advice I would give them is please do. We need you desperately for so many reasons. But one is, I have had a fortunate life, a life of extraordinary joy in activism, because I have been given so much from so many different kinds of people. And I don't know if in your country it's the same, but in our country, people who go along with how the world is are very unhappy, and they are very sterile, and they are killing themselves, actually. And so for
Yes.
us to understand, that's not because they're bad or weak people. That's because they are living a life that is unhealthy. It's destructive. It is asking them to shut down. So my advice to young people is to become active for change, not only because the world needs you, but because you need the world in that way. You need that kind of connection, that kind of interaction, and that kind of feeding from other people that can only come in the course of struggling for something beyond ourselves. So that's my best advice, I think.
I saw one of your interview and I saw you were talking about the water security. So can you please tell that?
Yes. Well, I'm sure you know in India, because I know you've, particularly the farmers in the South are experiencing this. Here in Detroit, we sit on the edge of the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes in the United States hold 22% of the world's fresh water. So surface water. So that's an enormous responsibility. And many, many people in Detroit feel that as a responsibility. And so we say water is a human right and a sacred trust. So those two ideas, that water, it should be free for everybody. Everybody needs water for life, but also the water itself needs our protection, are two ideas that have shaped a lot of my political activism in the last decade or so. And part of that has been the enormous inhumanity expressed in this country by charging so much for water. Some people can't afford it, and so therefore they are shut off. So we have been arguing for a more equitable system of funding the cost of providing water, so that everybody can have access to water. And that's a principle I think that we need to stand for globally. You know, if you talk very much about water security, what you find is some people say, well, we should be selling it all over the place, you know, that the only way you can have access is if you pay. And that is an anathema. That is against everything I believe about what people should have. People need water, they need education, they need healthcare, they need housing, and they need good food. And those are the things that allow us to flourish and to develop our lives. So water security is a major issue because for centuries, water has been something people had access to. And now in this late capitalist era, the water is becoming more and more scarce. It's becoming a commodity, and it's becoming something that is being taken away from some people so that other people can benefit from selling it. And that is something I think we have to resist. Is that helpful?
Yes, it's great. So what is your impact on the world? Like, how much do you think you have helped?
Impact? You know, that's hard to know. In some ways, I say I've lost every battle I've ever fought because the world's still in a mess. But on the other hand, you know, a couple nights ago, I was visiting a friend who I had met when she was 16, and she's now over 40. And I met her in a youth program, actually just a few years older than you, and some of them were 14 in that program. And she's now started her own school, which she has been running for 8 years. And so I look at someone like this young friend, and I didn't make her who she was, but I contributed to that. And I think,
yes.
I think a lot of my impact has been in relationships with other people who are also making change. So that's one way to think about it. Another way is, I mean, here and there we've had, you know, victories in terms of different struggles, but The problem with victories and struggles is they show you new problems. And so you have to work with those as well. You know, it's like, try to think of a really good example. You know, years and years ago, we fought to say women were equal to men. And so a lot of people, we sort of got some traction there, right? Well, then the next thing I know, women are saying, we want to be in the military so we can kill people. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not what we meant. You know, so it's like you win something, but when you win it, you create new problems. So the question of impact is, I think, more a question of meaning. Does your life have meaning for you and others? And I think yes on that, on many levels. And I think helping people to think more critically is something I've done well, both in my writing, my speaking, my teaching, and helping people to see that it is possible to live a long life for change. I think that's an impact too.
So what does your work look like in every day? Like, look like every day.
I'm sorry.
Do you ever get bored? Do you ever get bored of doing your work?
Bored? Did you say bored? Is that what you said?
Like,
oh my goodness, no, never. I can't imagine that. I don't get bored with anything. But life is if you are, I think some people approach social change that way though. They do the same thing over and over again. And that's probably not going to get them very far because the world changes every time you do something. So no, I have never been bored. I have always found excitement, interest, joy, curiosity in engagement with others. And that's really how you make change. You never make change by yourself. You only make it as you engage with others. And so like you and I are talking, I could not even think about being bored.
yes. Like, what is the coolest thing you did till now?
Oh, the coolest thing. Oh my. I'm not sure how cool I am, but let me think. I think maybe the coolest thing is now I'm captaining a riverboat. That's pretty cool. I'm taking people out on the Detroit River I'm a real captain. You know, I actually went through the course. I learned everything, and I take people on the river because I want to share something I love, but I want them to see, you know, this notion we talked about earlier about water scarcity and sacred trust. I want people to see how the Detroit River has regenerated, how it has survived the assault of industrial society. And last week, river otters came back. They have not been seen in the Detroit River in 100 years. And last week they were back. So I want to share that with people as a love, but also as a lesson for what's possible. I have a question for you, Aanya. What's the coolest thing you've done?
Actually, recently in my school there was a story competition. So I wrote a story and I got prize. So I just felt nice because I just love writing stories.
Oh, good. I would love to see some. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry you're going in and out on my speaker, so it was very hard, but thank you.
Yes, welcome. It was nice to talk to you.
It was nice to talk to you too.
Thank you, Dr. Shea and Aanya, for the great discussion and for all things we learned today. Thank you, Obootus, for listening to this interview. Make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter and to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can hear about upcoming sessions with other changemakers. Please also tell your friends about Oboot and share social media links with them. And last but not least, go to oboot.co to learn about opportunities to collect digital badges and plant trees.